And mom and dad bought one of these little footstools. I like this because that was a little movie. Yeah.
In my house, when you turned 13, you didn't have to wash dishes anymore. There's a pile behind me.
The next morning, it never came out.
Good evening. We are here tonight for the first presentation of the manager's budget and beginning of our workshop. So at this time, I'll turn it over to you, Brian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Appreciate the opportunity to again be in front of you. I believe this is the 8th budget that Anita and I have prepared for the board. First year, obviously, was a budget we worked on that was already in place when we got here. So look forward to having another one with you. They seem to come around every year. So just, again, I'll go through it for the folks who are going to watch it later to make sure that we hit all the highlights. But to give you the Reader's Digest version right to start with, in this budget, in this recommended budget, the tax rate remains the same. The budget, this year's budget is only 0.8% higher than last year's budget. Our water rates remain the same. We do go up by $5 on the solid waste fee, but that's less than 3%, and it's all tied to our contract with our waste hauler. And there's identified revenue surplus in the budget that will fully fund the pay study if you so choose to do that. So that's the Reader's Digest version of it. I'll start from the beginning to go through it. As you all are aware, and this is the budget message that is in your book, you have in your budget packet the binder, and it has 3 documents in it, generally 3 sections. The first is the continuation budget. That budget is the budget that continues to provide the exact services that you provided this year into the new fiscal year. We do have that conversation when we talk about our budget retreat about whether you want to change those things or you want to add things. But based on that, we provide you a budget that essentially continues the operations that the county is providing into the new year. And in this budget, all the services that were provided last year are again provided in the recommended budget. The second section is service expansion budgets. You've got 30 general fund and 9 enterprise fund expansions. Those are programs that are new or different, something different than what you were providing this year, whether it be an expansion of services, something more, or it may even be something less. If a department comes in and says, we recommend you cut this program or you take this piece of something out. So we call them service expansions. They may be service contractions. There are other folks, when they prepare their budgets, they call them decision packages. But historically, I always call them service expansions. And then the third section in your manual is in your book is the fee manual. And that's in an opportunity to lay out the fees that try to recover some of the cost to the direct recipients of those services instead of pushing them all to the general tax dollar. I report to you that the budget is balanced and it is prepared in accordance with the policies and procedures outlined in the local government budget and fiscal control act. So as you see on page 1, the process. We began this process obviously on January 26th with the board's planning retreat. We sent budget packages out to the county departments and outside agencies in early February. Those requests came back to the finance office in mid-March. And we had individual meetings with all of our department heads in early April. And in those meetings, the finance officer and I sat with department heads and we went through their budgets line item by line item, looking at where they were this year, where they were projected to end the year, what they thought would be changes coming in the upcoming year, and historically where they ended up. So we cut some of those budgets. We expanded some of those budgets based on some of the pressures that we're seeing in utilities and different things. So, but in that process, we touch every line item and we talk about every line item to make sure that we are where we need to be. After this meeting, we will go into our regular budget workshops, and you are scheduled to have a public hearing on the budget after you finish the workshops at your regular meeting on June the 5th. You have the option of adopting the budget that night if you so choose after the public hearing. If you do not want to adopt it that night, then we can certainly call a special called meeting on June the 12th for you to adopt the budget. I think we always do that every year just in case the board needs some more time or wants some additional information after the public hearing. But we also need to have the budget adopted by June 30th. So on page 2, we talk about the goals, and these goals are pretty static for us. It's what we look for in the budget. It's what we've come to expect out of a budget. You know, we continue to rely on financial plans and systems as we prepare our budget. We're not just willy-nilly throwing things against the wall. We have long-term financial plans. We have financial documents that the board has adopted that we look at to make sure we're within policy. We also conservatively estimate our revenues and expenditures to avoid expectations of performance that are not realistic. What we strive to provide for you in the budget is a budget that will do what it says it's going to do. What we don't want to do is underestimate or overestimate either the expenditures or the revenues so that it's unrealistic. So when we go into something, it's just not going to make sense. We believe that what we've done is going to come to fruition. Now, there are obviously, as we always talk about, there are obviously external pressures that bump up against our budget. But if things perform the way we hope they perform, and if they perform the way that we get our advice from the association and the League of Municipalities, our goal is that that budget does what it says it's going to do. We also, with our budget and with our department heads, try to create an atmosphere where efforts to spend down during the fiscal year are discouraged. That's not the way it is at state government level. It's not the way it is at the federal government level. I've worked at the state government level. I've not worked at the federal government level. But in a budget where you look at it and you say, oh my gracious, if I don't spend all this money, I'm not going to get it back. You tend to spend money at the end of the year kind of willy-nilly because you want to make sure you get the same amount of money next year. We don't do that. We create an atmosphere where we tell our department heads, if you need something, then spend it. But if you don't, you're not going to get penalized for it. That doesn't mean that we're going to take all the money away from you. We may reduce it a little bit based on historical trends, but we're not going to punish you for not spending your budget, which is essentially what happens at the state and federal government level. And what you find out with that is you end up having folks, spend money that they shouldn't spend just because they want to make sure they get it next year. We present the budget in an effort to try to reevaluate all expenditures and allow for policy review and potential service reductions or expansions based on other policy directives. So that comes from our initial planning piece and also comes from these workshops. And then we also try to provide an analysis of the county government cost centers so that it more clearly demonstrates where the general tax fund dollars are being spent and what services are being provided. I think we've talked about it every year since I've been here. Our budget is as much of a budgetary document as it is an educational document. And we want anybody who picks it up to be able to read it and hopefully understand where those tax dollars are spent, what you get for those tax dollars, and have a good understanding of where that money flows. So overall, for the budget, the recommended budget maintains the ad valorem tax rate at 62.5 cents per $100 of assessed valuation. As you'll recall, this board cut the tax rate by a penny in fiscal year 21-22, and it remains at that level, and this is the third straight year at that level, despite our increased inflation pressures. So we're very proud of that. The recommended budget maintains all county services and programs provided in the prior year. So we haven't gone in there and cut anything or deleted anything that you haven't told us to do. And just as a reminder, what we always look at is the South region CPI for the 12-month period, and that number for April was 5.5%. The recommended general fund budget is $69.5 million, and it is less than 1%. It's 0.8% greater than the original FY 22-23 budget. So we always compare original to original, so that we give you a good apples to apples comparison of where we were last year and where we started last year and where we start this year. So we're only 0.8% higher. The recommended budget increases the K-12 public school system funding levels over the prior year, We've done that by about a little over $1.4 million, or 8.7%. Now, that includes a 6.2% CPI adjustment for operations. And at the time we were building the budget, CPI was 6.2%. So we looked at school operations and said, we're going to fund those, we're going to recommend funding at 6.2% for CPI. And then there's additional statutory sales tax money that goes to the schools for capital funding. So that's why it's more than the 6.2, I think it's 6.8, 6.7 overall. As you recall, statutorily, there are certain sales tax articles, and when you get those, when those increase, there's a certain percentage by law that has to go to the school system for capital. So because sales tax has been as strong as it is, the funding to the school system statutorily has to increase for capital. You certainly have the ability to adjust this budget as you move along with that, and you can move those numbers up and down, but you would have to move it if you wanted to offset that. You would have to do that on the operational side, because the capital piece is in law that it has to go to capital. And again, I guess you could set it aside, but it's got to be for capital. The community college funding is increased by $190,000, a little over $190,000, and it meets the funding request that we got from the community college. The budget continues to fund the capital improvements fund that this board put in place in 1920 fiscal year for 1 penny of projected tax revenue that goes to the capital improvement fund, so that you can continue to maintain your capital investments, your facilities. It maintains the prior year fire and EMS rescue taxes, so those have not changed. It does, as we talked earlier, increase the solid waste fee by $5, and that's to offset the cost of increasing solid waste disposal with inflation. That's less than a 3% increase, and it is built into our contract. If you'll recall, when we entered the contract with our provider for solid waste, the first few years of that contract did not allow for any increase for the vendor. Later into the contract, which is where we are now, there's an allowance for increase. It was a CPI or 3%, whichever was less. So it's capped at 3%. I don't think anybody anticipated that we'd be at 5 and 6 and 7% inflation. So that one actually worked out in our favor because it's capped at 3%. So that's where you see that increase. The budget does not increase our water rates. Our water rates remain the same, and they are equal across all districts. That was done over a 5-year period and culminated this year with all those being equal. The budget, again, maintains our administrative charges to the enterprise funds that are used to help offset the general fund costs for providing those services. So in that, we are charging back to the enterprise funds, which are the business-like funds, the solid waste, the water funds. We're charging back to them the time that's put in by general fund employees. Part of my salary, part of finance salary, part of other salaries that are associated with providing services to those funds are being charged against those funds, rightfully so. That way they're paying their fair share. Otherwise, we're subsidizing. We don't want to do that. We want to show the full ride because the enterprise funds are set up to operate that way. So on page 3 of the message, the general fund, again, is $69.5 million. It maintains the same. It maintains the tax rate from this year. The estimated total taxable valuation for Beaufort County is a little over $6.4 billion, billion with a B, and it's made up of $5.7 billion in real and personal property and $682 million in motor vehicles. Those have increased, and you'll see that in this next bullet. Collections for real and personal properties are assumed at 98.6 and at 100% for motor vehicles. You'll recall the tax and tag program that went into place several years ago now makes it such that when you renew your tag, you have to pay your taxes. Years ago, there used to be an opportunity where you could kind of manipulate the system and not pay your taxes on your motor vehicles and still get your permit or get your registration renewed. That cut that took away that. So now we budget those at 100%. The collection rate for real and personal is up 0.38% from the prior audited period. And the law allows us to use for revenue calculation the fiscal year 21-22 audited collection rate of 98.6%. So that's what we're allowed to use as we look at what revenues we will bring in. The estimated real property valuation in 23-24 is up approximately 3.97%, or a little over $247 million from prior year. That comes directly from growth and from the work in the tax office of making sure that exemption programs, present use value programs, are being appropriately applied as they should and are coming off the rolls. Those exemptions are coming off when you're not eligible for that exemption. So there's been concerted effort by the assessor's office to make sure those are correct, as well as growth. There has been growth in the county. We're very pleased with that. You see the tax table. We always show you that tax table of where we were 8 years ago, where we are now. Next bullet point talks about the sales assessment ratio study. The Department of Revenue does that every year. It helps us determine what the ratio is between assessed and market value. So sales ratios greater than 1 indicate that assessed values are greater than the market. So that means that what we have on the books, if the ratio is greater than 1, it means that what we have on the books is actually greater than what the market's doing. You typically don't see that. But you remember several years ago when we had the recession, I was standing here in front of you and said, this is really unusual. This doesn't happen. You know, real property is depreciating, not appreciating. Real property typically appreciates. But that sales ratio lets us know what those numbers are. Sales ratios that are less than 1 indicate that the assessed values are less than the market values, which is typically what you see. You buy a piece of property, we peg it, as you know, we peg that number once every 8 years. There's been a change now. The board's decided to change the reevaluation cycle a little bit, but then it was once every 8 years, and that number sticks. It doesn't change until we do a revaluation. So the market flows up and down, and typically the market goes up. The market has gone up tremendously in the last couple of years. So you will see that you take the sales ratio, you multiply that by the tax rate, and it gives you an effective tax rate. It essentially gives you an apples-to-apples comparison across the state. So if you look at Beaufort County, and on that next page you'll see Beaufort County has a tax rate of 62.5. Our 2023 sales ratio from the Department of Revenue is 0.689. If you multiply that by each other, that gives us an effective tax rate of 41.18 cents. And that ranks us the 19th lowest county in North Carolina in taxes. 81 counties have a higher effective tax rate than we do, and 18 have a lower effective tax rate than we do. So on page 4, you'll see we always show you our surrounding counties, and out of that, you can see that our neighbors are higher than us, and we're really proud of where we are on that number. I think that it's a tribute to this board and how you've managed the budgets over the years and what you've done and how you've tried to get good value and make sure that the rates are where they need to be. Our projected sales tax revenues are up about $2.1 million, or 16.71% from prior year original. So they are up tremendous. But they have been conservatively estimated based on guidance that we get from the League of Municipalities and the Association of County Commissioners. And they're projected to grow 1.85% less than what they grew last year. So there is some tempering of that. And again, it's anticipated that inflation and the efforts by the Federal Reserve to contain that inflation will slow the sales tax growth in the upcoming year. I think we've started to see some of that slight cooling, but it changes on a daily basis. So, but we have anticipated, based on the best advice that we could get from the folks that look at this, that there is going to be a decrease in the growth of sales tax, but it's still higher than we've seen in prior years. Intergovernmental revenues are estimated to decrease a little over $500,000, almost $600,000, and that's attributed to the decrease in state and federal grant funding and the elimination of the EMS Medicaid cost reimbursement program. You'll recall that a year or so ago they started moving to that point where we would file with the state all of our costs associated with Medicaid for EMS. Then there was a pot of money that was left over. They would do all those calculations, and they'd send us a check for our portion of that. So in restructuring of that, they did away with the Medicaid cost reimbursement. So that's where we were bringing that money in on the back end. So they've eliminated that. That's why you see that decreasing. The next bullet talks about license and fees and other general fund revenues are up, projected to be up almost $400,000. And that is primarily related to the increase in EMS collections due to that Medicaid restructuring. So instead of reimbursing the county a smaller amount for Medicaid, and then on the back end, making up the difference and saying, okay, yeah, you really ought to got this much. When they restructured it all, they said, we're going to pay you this much up front. So the rate is a whole lot higher rate. With that, they did away with the reimbursements. So those will change as we go forward, but I think ours are about $1,000 on reimbursement. So they're a lot higher than they used to be. Investment earnings are projected to reach about $1.2 million. And that is, of course, due to the Federal Reserve's actions to slow inflation by raising the interest rates. We're back to where we're able to make some decent money on reserve funds. And our finance officer and her staff do an absolutely fantastic job of watching those funds and laddering those investments so that we are maximizing our return on those idle funds. The recommended budget appropriates zero in fund balance. So we're not asking the board to appropriate any fund balance. And then as we talk about fund balance, there's a page in there that says that, but these are the highlights. As of June 30th, 22, the audited numbers show that the county's general fund balance was $28,729,788, or 45.19% of expenditures. At the close of this fiscal year, we estimate that the unassigned general fund balance will be $26,739,719, or 37.22% of expenditures. And that reduction is due to the board's transfer of excess fund balance to the Facility Improvements Capital Project Fund in this fiscal year 22-23. That action was in accordance with the board's adopted fund balance policy. And it now sets that amount just slightly over the 35% target that the policy says you should be at. The recommended budget projects $2.3 million in revenues over expenditures for the continuation budget. That surplus is adequate to fund the pay and classification study that was authorized by the board in 22-23. We just got those numbers Friday evening from the company doing the work for us. And we look forward to going through those and having some conversation with you about it. But the big number, the overall number of about 1.7, and you'll see that in your expansion package, is there are enough revenues over expenditures to fully fund that, if you so choose to fully fund that pay study. On page 5, you'll see that, again, our major revenue source in the pie chart is property taxes. That's the majority of where we get our funding from, 56.5%. Sales tax is about 20.9%, and then the remaining is made up of the rest of it. But those are our two heavy funding sources. On the expenditure side, general government cost centers, and we exclude debt service and transfer to other funds in the general government cost center. Overall, they increased by 2.7% from prior year. The main driver in that is a 26% increase in property and liability insurance premiums from the North Carolina Association of County Commissioners Risk Management Pool. Now, before we beat up on the association, we've had detailed conversations with them about that. Everybody across the state was hit with that, and essentially the reason is because the reinsurance market has essentially collapsed. There's a handful of companies that are still in the reinsurance business, the Lords of London, those groups, because of natural disasters, pandemic, those things over the year. So everybody understands that when you're an insurance company, you're providing insurance, there's a certain amount of tolerance you're willing to take on, a certain amount of risk you're willing to take on. And then you turn around and buy reinsurance on top of that so that you don't get wiped out. Well, evidently, over the last few years, due to natural disasters and pandemic and all those things, they've taken, I mean, you've seen it in the paper and read about it in the news, they've taken some pretty substantial hits to the insurance market. So a lot of those companies who were in the reinsurance business have gotten out of the reinsurance business. So the numbers of companies that are providing reinsurance have gotten smaller, and with that, the price goes up. So that is why we're getting that additional increase, is simply because the reinsurance market has adjusted up. Our hope is that as things settle back down, that'll get better. We certainly hope so. Under our human services cost centers, those expenditures and those cost center, and that cost center is down by 3%. That's driven by a decrease in the DSS projected expenditures, which we get from the state of North Carolina. They tell us, looking at it, we anticipate this is what you're going to spend at DSS. And then also, we moved jail health program out from underneath the health department because the health department's no longer going to be doing that. We're moving back to a third-party contractor. So we've moved that out of the health department budget, and it's now underneath the sheriff's office budget, where it originally was as a contract service in jail, in the jail division. So that drove that up, or that drove that cost center down under human services. Likewise, you'll see it up on the public safety side. Community services cost centers, those cost centers decreased overall by about 5.6%. And as you'll recall, last year, we had some capital expenditures. You had a tractor in the cooperative extension budget. You had a truck in the planning department, and we had some one-time funding in the prior year budget for several outside agencies. Those are not in this year's budget. So that's why you see the decrease come down by about 5.6% in the community services cost center. The education cost centers we've talked about. The recommended budget across that overall center has gone up 8.3%. K-12 is at 8.7%, and the community college is at 6%. The community college was funded at what they asked for. We were not able to fully fund the K-12 system with what they asked for, but we looked at it on a CPI of 6.2, and then the additional statutorily required sales tax numbers took that to about 8.7% increase, a little over 1.4 million. Public safety cost centers expenditures and those cost centers are up about 6.4% overall. Again, the main drivers of that are increased operational costs from the sheriff's office. We looked at that at a 6.2% CPI with the new sheriff being in place to hold that office generally essentially where it was, and then moving jail health back underneath the jail cost center as a contracted services. That pushed it up just a little bit. You'll see on page 6 the expenditure pie chart. This is generally what every county in North Carolina looks like. Education is your number one funder. We fund that at about 33% of our budget. Human services is typically number 2. We fund that at 28% of our budget. And then public safety traditionally lines out at about number 3 for everybody, and ours is funded at 24%. Everything else is small stuff. We move into the enterprise funds. Again, when we talk about enterprise funds, those are business-like funds. We don't treat them like a general tax fund. They're financed and operated in a manner that's similar to a private business, where the intent is that the cost of providing goods or services to the general public on a continuing basis is financed or recovered primarily through user charges. So, we've got some strong financials in there where we look at what do the rates need to be able to cover the cost, fully cover the cost, and that's what that does. So the water fund, again, the budget this year is recommended at $8.7 million. There's no change in the water rates from the prior year, and the rates are even across the district. We do continue the 10-year capital improvement plan for the entire water system. That was established in fiscal year 18-19, and we continue to use that long-term plan to look at where we need to be in our capital improvements. Speaking of capital, we're programming a little over $265,000 for capital, and there is some contingency allowed in the water fund of a little over $76,000. The solid waste fund is recommended at $4.3 million. It does include a $5 increase per year in the solid waste fee, taking it to a total of $180. So it was $175. We're recommending it go to $180, and that's to pay the increased cost of disposal related to inflation, and that is less than a 3% increase. I want to say it's like 2.7, 2.8%. We also have the continuation of the engineering studies for the proposal for solid waste megasites, one on the north, one on the south, but those projects will be funded outside the annual budget, so you won't see those projects in this budget. They will they will be funded outside the annual budget process in a special project once the board gets to the point where it makes a decision about what it wants to do. Then what we'll do, like we always do, is you'll identify those funds, we'll set up a special project fund, and that's where those funds will flow to, and that's where those projects will be handled out of. So if I can wrap up for you, in summary, the recommended budget continues all prior year provided services and operations, and does so while maintaining the ad valorem rate of 62.5 cents per $100 worth of valuation, despite the continued impact of record and high levels of inflation and increased demands for service. We're obviously seeing, as the pandemic wound down, we saw that last year, not only with the inflation, but we also saw an increase in demand for level of service. People wanted more services and needed more services. And I don't mean services that we weren't providing, but things like our animal control, more calls for service, more demand for services, things we were currently providing, but we weren't providing as much of at the time. The volume has just gone up. Same across all of our centers. The budget does increase the fee associated with solid waste enterprise fund by $5. Talked a little bit about that. It maintains water rates across the districts, and they are uniform across them. The continuation budget projects a surplus, a revenue surplus that we recommend to you be able to be used to fund the updated pay and classification plan. And we structured this in the recommendations just like we did the last pay plan, where it would provide a minimum 5% base salary increase. So that would either be 5% COLA or the increase recommended by the pay plan, whichever is greater, exactly the way we did it last time. And the reason is so that the efforts by this board to modernize the pay and classification plan and reach market rates are not lost due to the current 12-month CPI of 5.5. And the prior year, last year, the CPI was 8.8, and we were actually only able to fund that at 5%. So we're behind 0.5%. If you look at the current 12-month, the April 12-month of 5.5, and then we were off 3.8% last year that we weren't able to fully fund the 8.8. We only funded at 5. So this recommendation is to try to keep us at least whole, obviously to keep our employees and pay them what market is, and we're not exempt from the demands that you're seeing across the business industry for people looking for employees. And we have talented people who work really hard, and we need to try to hang on to those, and we don't want folks leaving us because they can because they're underpaid relative to the market. So obviously, as we say every year, the performance of local, state, and even national economies are going to have an impact on the execution of this budget. Inflation is still a big challenge for us. We've started to see maybe a tweak of what the Federal Reserve is doing on hiking rates to try to cool that a little bit. Might be a little bit of signs that that's working. However, we've got to anticipate that there will continue to be high cost to deliver services throughout the next fiscal year. And we've got to watch that closely to make sure this budget performs as it is. Montgomery County is also on its way to increasing access to economic development, healthcare, education, and quality of life opportunities in its great grant partnership with Brightspeed to increase broadband access and affordability across the county. New and continued investments with additional telecommunication providers through future grant opportunities and local funding will be required for the county to reach its full potential. So there's still funding out there, there's still grant opportunities, and there's still additional providers out there, along with Brightspeed, who are excited about doing work in Beaufort County and bringing that generational changing opportunity for broadband to places that have not had that, and we're excited about that. And this board should be very proud of your commitment that you currently have with the Great Grant to help serve areas that are underserved or unserved with broadband. Putting together a budget is obviously a tremendous effort, and I want to thank our finance director, Anita Radcliffe, and her staff, as every year they do an outstanding job in helping create a budget that's informative and functional and serves as a really good management tool and outline for which the board and the public in general can look at that and make decisions and understand where funds go and how they flow. And I'm really thankful for their long, hard hours of work and dedication. Likewise, our department managers did a really good job in providing a budget that we asked them to provide based on the guidelines that we got from the board at the planning session. Their efforts to make sure that they were where they needed to be, I think, reflects really clearly in the budget. When we bring a budget to you that continues all services and operations and we're less than the increase in 1% from prior year, I think there was some really good, strong work that they did. And they deserve a lot of thanks and tremendous admiration for what they do. I am very proud to work every day with a bunch of folks who have been called to public service, and I think just do an outstanding and absolute job in what they do, and I'm very proud to do that. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to present this budget to you. Again, this is number 8, and look forward to going into the workshops with you. That starts Thursday night. We always try to give a little bit of a lull in between the night that I give you the budget and the opportunity that we start off at the next meeting, so that if there are things that pop up as you're looking through it, if there are things that pop up that you need some additional information, please reach out to me or Anita or one of her staff so we can get that information to you ahead of the budget workshops that are coming up, because we want you to have all the information, and we don't want to have to wait on it. We don't want to. We can certainly find the information on the go, but we'd like to have it in front of you ahead of time if you need something, so that you have some opportunity to look at it and digest it and make good decisions. So, again, I thank you for your time and patience this evening, and Mr. Chairman, I'll be happy to answer any questions or look forward to seeing the board at its next budget workshop.
Everybody good?
No, I would like, we're meeting on Thursday, this coming Thursday night, and we've specifically said that the third Thursday, I can't meet. I'm not sure that Commissioner Deathridge can meet. I'd like to change that to something that accommodates all of the members of the board.
What's the wishes of the commissioners?
That's a motion.
Is there a second? Hearing none, it dies.
I will not be here.
Following Thursday.
Pardon?
I was just looking at the calendar.
You've got 2 months to get this budget done. I don't see what's so important about forcing Thursday night, other than the commissioners want to approve this budget during the first meeting in June, so they can have a month of June off. You have a whole month. You have an additional month. The board, this board, for the last couple of years, has not been willing to accommodate some of us on the board when we wanted to change meeting dates. And I would also point out to you that meeting date on Thursday was never voted by this board. It was pulled out of the air. It's not fair. It's not fair to the public.
Wait a minute.
I went back to the January meeting, and we the Thursday wasn't discussed, the 23rd. The 23rd was discussed, but I went back to look and see what I could find, and we never talked about that Thursday.
We did make a change when we found out the State Association was having their meeting in Raleigh next week on the 23rd. I think that was one of the meetings.
The issue is not what was discussed at the meeting. The issue is whether the board is willing to consider the wishes of some of the board members. You've done this to Stan. You refused to accommodate him. You're refusing to accommodate me. And I'll just be frank with you. I'll be at the Conservative Club meeting on Thursday night. We meet every Thursday night of the year. I will be there at that club meeting. So you guys are wasting a month. You've got a whole month to do this, and you just want to be mean-spirited. That's all right. That's fine with me. I can play the game with you.
I don't think we're trying to be mean-spirited. I mean, we've had it on the calendar. We also have a meeting scheduled.
week.
We also have a meeting scheduled for Thursday night, and I'm choosing the priority being the county commissioners' budget workshop. Gentlemen, we'll reconvene on Thursday night, or Thursday, I guess, afternoon, around 5 o'clock. We'll start at 5. So have a good evening.